Hello, everyone. So, this week we will be examining conflict and we'll be answering the questions: what is conflict? What is the purpose of conflict in literature? And also, how can understanding conflict not only help us to better understand a text, but also our own lives? So, for today's objectives, first, I can distinguish between internal and external conflicts. And second, I can identify the protagonist and antagonist in a conflict. So, to start off, what is a conflict? So, a conflict is a struggle between two opposing forces. Conflict creates plot, which we will look into more throughout this week. It's also important to note that stories can have more than one conflict. And all conflicts fall into one of two categories, so conflicts can either be internal or external. So, to begin today, let's look at the difference between internal and external conflicts. So, internal conflicts. The only true form of an internal conflict is character versus self. So, in a character versus self conflict, the character faces a struggle within him or herself, and this conflict occurs in the mind of the character. These types of conflicts often involve morality or emotions. So, a character will struggle with right and wrong, struggle to make a decision about what to do, or perhaps they have an emotion that is preventing them from doing what they'd like to do. So maybe they'd like to do something, but they are afraid. So some examples of internal conflicts. First, I want to run for class president, but I'm afraid to give a speech in front of the entire 7th grade class. So this is an example of an internal conflict where a character's fear is preventing him or her from accomplishing a goal. Next, I feel guilty for giving my friends the answers to the math test. So here's another example of an internal conflict where a character is struggling with an emotion. In this case, a character feels guilty about a decision that he or she made. And then finally, should I play softball or audition for the play? So in this example, a character is struggling with a decision and he or she is trying to decide what the right course of action is for them to take. Next, external conflicts. So an external conflict is a struggle between a character and an outside force. There are many types of external conflicts, including character versus nature, character versus society, character versus the supernatural, and character versus technology. Now we'll look more in depth at these different types of external conflicts throughout this week, but for now I just want to make sure that you understand that an external conflict is a struggle between a character and an outside force, and also know that they're not just physical altercations, but also include opposing ideas, which I'll show you more in a moment. So some examples of external conflicts. An 8th grader on my bus is picking on me. So this is an example of a character being bullied as an external conflict. Now we don't know if this is physical bullying or verbal bullying, but either way, it's a conflict that's occurring outside of the character. It's a character versus character conflict. Next, my mom's car slid off the road during a snowstorm. So again, this is an external conflict because the issue is occurring between the character and an outside force, in this case, nature. And then finally, a girl wants to join the wrestling team, but everyone keeps telling her that wrestling is for boys. So here's an example of an external conflict that's actually an opposing idea, where a character wants to do something, but she is told by society or the community that she can't. Now I'd like to spend a little bit more time talking about the opposing forces that I keep mentioning, so the protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist is the lead character of a story, and the term protagonist derives from the classical Greek drama, literally meaning first actor. So every narrative will have at least one protagonist, and it's important to note that the protagonist is not always a hero, so it's not always the good guy, but it is always the lead character or the character that is driving the plot of the story. The antagonist is an opponent of the protagonist or an obstacle that prevents him or her from reaching a goal. So this term also derives from Greek, anti meaning against, and agonist meaning actor. Antagonist can take many forms, so it could be one person like a villain, it could be a group of people, it could be a force of nature, and it could also be an internal conflict where the character is struggling with an emotion that's preventing him or her from reaching a goal, such as fear or guilt. So in any case, all antagonists challenge the protagonist in some way. So it's time for some guided practice. So for each example that I'm about to show you, identify the protagonist and antagonist, and then also identify whether the conflict is internal or external. So example number 1. Ronnie has won second place in the science fair for the last 2 years, and Newton Robinson has taken first. Ronnie hated how Newton gloated and held those victories high over Ronnie's head. This year, Ronnie will stop at nothing to beat Newton. Can Ronnie win against the undefeated Newton at this year's science fair? So if you'd like, you could pause here, but I'd like you to determine the protagonist, the antagonist, and then whether or not this is an internal or external conflict. So the protagonist of the story is Ronnie because he is the central character. The antagonist, or the person that is opposing Ronnie and preventing him from reaching his goal, is Newton. And then this is an external conflict because the conflict is occurring outside of the character. Okay, example number 2. After breaking his mother's favorite vase, Casey struggles to decide whether he should tell his mother the truth or attempt to hide his mistake and blame the family dog. So for this, I'd like you to determine the protagonist, so who's the lead character, the antagonist, so what's preventing the lead character from reaching his goal, and then whether or not this is an internal or external conflict. So the protagonist of the story is Casey. The antagonist is actually also Casey, so this conflict is occurring within Casey. So his actions and his guilt over his actions are the main obstacles. And the type is an internal conflict because Casey's struggle is within himself. All right, finally, example number 3. Janie is on a whitewater rafting trip along a choppy river when their guide suddenly has a heart attack. Now she and the other passengers must learn to work together to survive the treacherous rapids. Will Janie make it home safely? So first identify the protagonist, then the antagonist, then tell me whether this is an internal or external conflict. So the protagonist of this example is Janie. The antagonist is actually nature, the rapids, the dangerous water, right? And then this is an external conflict because Janie is struggling against the forces of nature in order to stay alive. All right, so now I'd like you to complete the independent practice for today's lesson. So I'd like you to identify the internal and external conflicts, and then also identify the protagonist and antagonist for each example. So I'll show you how to do that. So on your form, you'll get to a page that looks like this, where you will read each example and then identify whether there is an internal or external conflict. So you'll read this one. John was frustrated at himself for forgetting his basketball shoes, and then you'll decide whether that's an internal or external conflict. After you've answered all those questions, you'll get to this page where you can read the short blurb and then determine the protagonist, antagonist, and then whether or not it's an internal or external conflict. Once you're done with all that, remember to submit your form. Please let your teacher know if you have any questions or need any help. Good luck and have a great day.